What happens when two of Britain's most outspoken personalities collide on live television over one of the most divisive topics in modern royal history? In just 41 seconds, what was supposed to be a light-hearted reunion between old friends would explode into the most explosive confrontation Piers Morgan's show had ever witnessed. This is the story of how a casual mention of Meghan Markle transformed a celebrated actor into an adversary, how a friendship spanning decades shattered in real time, and why sometimes the cost of speaking your mind is higher than anyone expects. What unfolded that morning would leave viewers speechless, producers scrambling, and prove that even the strongest bonds can break when pride and principle collide. The Good Morning. Britain studios hummed with their usual breakfast time energy that crisp January morning in 2025. Michael Caine, now 91 years old, and still one of Britain's most treasured acting legends, had been booked for what everyone assumed would be a warm, nostalgic interview. The plan was simple: discuss his remarkable career spanning 7 decades, talk about his latest memoir, share some behind-the-scenes stories from his most iconic films, and perhaps reminisce about the golden age of British cinema. Piers Morgan and Michael had known each other for over 20 years, their relationship built on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for straight-talking, no-nonsense conversation. The production team had even joked during the morning briefing that this would be the easiest interview of the week. Two friends chatting over coffee with the nation watching. Nobody, absolutely nobody could have predicted that within 15 minutes, Michael Caine would storm off set in the middle of a live broadcast, leaving behind a studio in chaos and a friendship in ruins. Michael settled into the guest chair with his characteristic easy charm, that familiar Cockney accent warming up the studio as he exchanged pleasantries with Piers and co-host Susanna Reid. The audience watching at home saw exactly what they expected: two old friends catching up, laughing about shared memories, the kind of comfortable banter that comes from genuine affection and years of knowing each other. Piers leaned back in his chair with that confident smile he wore so well, clearly delighted to have such a beloved figure on the show. "Michael," he began warmly, "it's absolutely wonderful to have you here. You look fantastic for 91, I have to say. What's the secret?" "Clean living and good company," Michael replied with that twinkle in his eye that had charmed audiences for generations. "Though I suspect the clean living ship sailed a long time ago, so I'm relying heavily on the good company part." The studio crew laughed. Susanna smiled genuinely, and everything seemed perfect, comfortable, safe. They moved through the expected topics with practiced ease. Michael shared a hilarious story about working with Sean Connery on The Man Who Would Be King, talked about the technical challenges of filming in difficult locations, and had the crew in stitches with his impression of various directors he'd worked with over the years. Piers was in his element, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments, clearly enjoying himself immensely. But then, approximately 12 minutes into what had been a thoroughly pleasant interview, Piers made a decision that would change everything. He shifted in his seat slightly, that tell that regular viewers knew meant he was about to steer the conversation somewhere more provocative, and said with deliberate casualness, "Michael, I know we've had our chats privately about various topics over the years, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on something that's been dominating headlines. What's your take on the whole Harry and Meghan situation?" The question landed in the studio like a grenade with the pin pulled. Susanna Reid's smile faltered immediately, her eyes widening slightly as she glanced between Piers and Michael with obvious concern. Michael's expression, which had been open and friendly just seconds before, shifted into something more guarded, more careful. He set down the coffee cup he'd been holding and looked directly at Piers with an intensity that hadn't been there moments ago. "That's quite a shift in topic, Piers," he said quietly. "From discussing films to discussing the royal family. Are you sure you want to go down this particular road?" Piers, apparently misreading Michael's tone as playful reluctance rather than genuine warning, pressed forward with that boldness that had made him both famous and infamous. Come on, Michael. You've never been shy about sharing your opinions. I'm just asking what you think about two people who've spent the last few years complaining about their privileged lives while most people are struggling to pay their bills. The studio. Temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Michael straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening visibly. Susanna jumped in quickly, her voice carrying a note of desperation as she tried to redirect. Perhaps we could talk about Michael's upcoming projects instead. I believe you're working on something exciting. But Piers waved her off dismissively, his attention locked entirely on Michael now, clearly sensing he'd struck a nerve, and, true to form, deciding to push harder rather than back away. No, Susanna, I think this is interesting. Michael's been unusually quiet on this subject, and I genuinely like to know his thoughts. After all, he's someone who came from nothing, worked his way up through sheer talent and determination, made something of himself without complaining about how hard it was. Surely he must have some perspective on people who seem to do nothing but complain, despite having every advantage. Michael's eyes had gone cold now, the warmth completely extinguished. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was steel underneath. Piers, I'm going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. I came here this morning to talk about my work, my career, and perhaps share some entertaining stories with your viewers. I did not come here to be used as ammunition in your personal vendetta against two people I've never met and know nothing about. The directness of it seemed to catch Piers off guard, but only for a moment. He recovered quickly, that famous smirk sliding into place. Personal vendetta. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I'm simply asking legitimate questions about public figures who put themselves in the spotlight and then complain about the attention. Surely that's fair game for discussion. No, Piers, Michael said firmly. What you're doing isn't asking legitimate questions. What you're doing is trying to bait me into saying something negative about people I've never met, so you can use it to validate your own obsession. And I'm not going to do it. Susanna Reid looked genuinely alarmed now, clearly recognizing that this interview was spiraling completely out of control. Her years of professionalism kicked in as she attempted once more to salvage the situation. Michael, why don't you tell us about the research you did for your role in? Susanna, please, Piers interrupted sharply, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate her intervention. Michael and I are having a conversation here, then turning back to his guest with barely concealed irritation. You know, Michael, I'm surprised at you. I thought you of all people would understand the importance of free speech and honest discussion. Since when did you become so politically correct? The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Michael leaned forward slowly, his famous face hardening into an expression that would have been right at home in one of his more intense dramatic roles. Since when did I become politically correct? Let me tell you something about political correctness, Piers. What you call political correctness, I call basic human decency. There's a difference between honest discussion and using your platform to relentlessly attack people who can't defend themselves in the same forum. What you've been doing for years now regarding Meghan Markle specifically isn't journalism. It isn't commentary. It's borderline harassment. The words landed like physical blows. Piers's face flushed red, his famous temper beginning to show. Several crew members exchanged nervous glances while the director in the control room frantically tried to decide if they should cut to commercial. Harassment? Piers's voice had risen significantly. How dare you accuse me of harassment? I'm a journalist, asking questions that millions of people want answered. If Meghan Markle and her husband choose to do interview after interview, documentary after documentary, airing their grievances, then they open themselves up to scrutiny. That's how this works. Michael shook his head slowly, disappointment clear on his face. No, Piers, that's not how this works. Or at least it's not how it should work. You've taken a personal dislike to this woman. That much has been obvious to anyone paying attention. And you've spent years using your considerable platform to demean her, question her motives, dismiss her experiences, and encourage others to do the same. That's not journalism. That's a personal crusade dressed up as professional commentary. Piers stood up from his desk, something he rarely did during interviews, his body language aggressive and defensive simultaneously. A personal crusade? I've simply reported on the facts. I've questioned inconsistencies in their story. I've held them accountable for their actions. That's what journalists are supposed to do. Michael remained seated, but his voice grew stronger, more forceful. Held them accountable? Piers, you didn't even believe her when she talked about experiencing suicidal thoughts. You said on air, on this very program, that you didn't believe a word she said. You questioned her mental health struggles on national television. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? How many people watching might have been struggling with their own mental health and heard you, someone with authority and a platform, essentially saying that people who talk about suicide might just be making it up for attention? The studio had gone completely silent. Every crew member, every camera operator, everyone present seemed to be holding their breath. Susanna Reid had her hand over her mouth, clearly shocked by the turn this conversation had taken. Piers's face had gone from red to almost purple. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I stand by every word I said, he declared, his voice shaking slightly with anger. I don't believe she was suicidal. I think she was manipulative, calculating, and playing the victim to gain sympathy. And I have every right to say that. Michael stood up then, slowly, deliberately, his 91 years showing in the careful way he rose, but his presence filling the studio nonetheless. You have the right to say it, yes, he said quietly, dangerously. Freedom of speech gives you that right, but having the right to say something doesn't make it right to say it. And it doesn't protect you from the consequences of saying it. Before Piers could respond, Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Let me tell you something about women and mental health, and speaking up, Piers. I've been in this business for 70 years. I've seen what it does to people. The pressure, the scrutiny, the constant judgment, the media circus that follows certain individuals relentlessly. I've watched talented people crumble under that weight. I've lost friends to depression and suicide. So when someone, anyone, says they were struggling with their mental health, my first instinct isn't to question their honesty. My first instinct is compassion, because I've seen too much to assume they're lying for attention. Piers took a step closer to Michael, his height advantage making the gesture somewhat intimidating. Oh, please spare me the lecture, he snapped. You're going to stand there and tell me that someone who married a prince, lives in a mansion in California, has millions of dollars and every privilege imaginable, was really at risk of taking her own life. Do you know how that sounds to people who are genuinely struggling? Michael's voice when he responded was ice cold. Do you know what you sound like, Piers? You sound like someone who's never experienced a moment of genuine empathy in your life. Money doesn't protect you from mental illness. Fame doesn't cure depression. Being married to a prince doesn't make you immune to feeling trapped, isolated, or hopeless. Mental health doesn't discriminate based on bank balance or social status, and the fact that you think it does reveals a staggering ignorance that should disqualify you from commenting on the subject at all. The brutality of the assessment seemed to stun Piers into momentary silence. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with barely controlled fury. So now I'm ignorant? This from a man who admits he's never even met these people but is willing to defend them unconditionally. At least my opinions are based on watching their actions, their interviews, their constant need for attention while claiming they want privacy. Michael picked up his microphone and began removing it, his movements deliberate and final. My opinions aren't based on defending them. Piers. My opinions are based on basic human psychology and decades of watching how the media treats people, particularly women who don't fit neatly into the boxes society wants them in. You've built a career, or at least a significant part of your recent career, on tearing down one woman. You mock her, you question her motives, you dismiss her pain. You encourage millions of people to do the same through your platform. And for what? Because she hurt your feelings at some party years ago? Because she didn't respond to your messages? Because you feel she somehow betrayed Britain by choosing her own happiness over royal duty? Susanna Reid finally found her voice again, though it was shaky. Michael, please, perhaps we can take a break and come back to this conversation more calmly. Michael shook his head, placing his microphone on the chair. There's nothing calm about this, Susanna. Your co-host has spent years conducting a personal vendetta disguised as journalism, and frankly, I'm disgusted that I ever considered him a friend. Piers, if we were ever friends, clearly I misjudged you completely. The words hit harder than any insult. Piers actually recoiled slightly, genuine hurt flashing across his face before anger reasserted itself. Misjudged me? I've been nothing but consistent in my views. You're the one who's changed, Michael. You've gone soft, afraid to speak the truth because you might offend someone. The old you would have been right there with me, calling out the hypocrisy and the victimhood. No, Michael said firmly. The old me, as you put it, learned over decades that speaking the truth doesn't mean being cruel. It doesn't mean lacking compassion. It doesn't mean building your entire professional identity around hatred of one person you've never met. Because that's what you've done, Piers. This isn't about journalism anymore. This is personal for you, and everyone can see it except, apparently, you. Piers moved around his desk, getting closer to Michael, his voice dropping to something more intense, more personal. You want to know what's personal? I'll tell you what's personal. That woman played me for a fool. She used me when it suited her, dropped me the moment she didn't need me anymore, and then had the audacity to act like she's some innocent victim of the big bad British press. So yes, maybe it is personal. Maybe I don't like seeing someone manipulate their way through life and then play the victim when they're called out on it. Michael looked at Piers with something approaching pity. And there it is. Finally the truth. This entire crusade, all the hours of broadcast time, all the columns written, all the venom directed at this woman and her husband, it all comes down to your ego being bruised. She didn't want to be your friend, Piers. She met someone, fell in love, got married, and moved on with her life. And you couldn't handle it. The assessment was devastating in its simplicity and accuracy. Piers's mouth opened and closed several times, searching for a response that wouldn't confirm exactly what Michael had just suggested. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. That's not what this is about. This is about holding people accountable for their actions, for their lies, for the damage they've done to the royal family and to this country. Michael picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. The royal family, he said with a bitter laugh. Piers, the royal family has survived centuries of scandals, wars, abdications, divorces, and genuinely appalling behavior from various members. They will survive one couple choosing to step back and live their lives on their own terms. But will you survive losing your identity as the man who hates Meghan Markle? Because that's what you've become. Not a respected journalist, not a provocative commentator, just the man with the obsession. And it's sad to watch. Susanna stood up then, her professionalism finally overriding her shock. Michael, I'm so sorry this interview has gone this way. Please know that many of us here don't share these views, and we deeply respect your perspective. Michael's expression softened when he looked at her. Thank you, Susanna. You've always conducted yourself with grace and professionalism, even when working alongside someone who seems determined to do the opposite. I appreciate your attempts to keep this civil, even though it was clearly a losing battle from the start. Piers let out a harsh, bitter laugh. How noble of you both, Saint Susanna and Sir Michael, united in their moral superiority. Well, let me tell you something. At least I have the courage to say what I think, even when it's unpopular. At least I don't hide behind false politeness and pretend everything is fine when it's not. At least I'm honest about my feelings. Michael turned to face Piers one final time before leaving. Honest about your feelings. Yes, you are. Brutally, relentlessly honest about your anger, your resentment, your need to punish someone who didn't give you the attention you felt you deserved. But honesty without compassion, Piers. Honesty without wisdom or restraint. That's not something to be proud of. That's just cruelty with a thin veneer of principle painted over it. Piers stepped even closer, his face inches from Michael's now. Get off my show, he said, his voice low and dangerous. If you're going to stand there and lecture me about compassion while defending people who've done nothing but damage, then get out. I don't need your judgment, and I certainly don't need your friendship. Michael held his gaze steadily. I was already leaving, Piers. You didn't have to ask twice. And as for our friendship, if it was ever real, you destroyed it the moment you chose your personal vendetta over basic human decency. I'm just disappointed it took me this long to see what you'd become. With that, Michael Caine turned and walked toward the studio exit. His posture was straight, his head held high despite his age, every inch the legendary figure he'd been for 7 decades. The studio crew parted silently to let him through, many of them clearly sympathetic to his position, several looking genuinely upset at what they had witnessed. As he reached the edge of the set, he paused and looked back, not at Piers, but at Susanna. "Take care of yourself, Susanna," he said kindly. "You deserve better than this circus." Then he was gone, leaving behind a studio in shocked silence and a host whose face was twisted with a mixture of anger, hurt, and something that might have been shame if he'd been willing to acknowledge it. Piers stood motionless for several long seconds, his breathing heavy, his hands still clenched. Then he whirled around to face the cameras, that aggressive defiance reasserting itself. "Well," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I suppose that's what happens when you speak the truth in this country nowadays. People can't handle it. They'd rather protect their feelings than face reality." Susanna's voice was quiet but firm when she responded. "Piers, with respect, that wasn't speaking truth. That was a personal argument that never should have happened on air. We invited a beloved actor to discuss his career, and instead he was subjected to a confrontation about topics he clearly didn't want to engage with. That's not good broadcasting, that's not good journalism, and it's certainly not treating a guest with the respect they deserve." Piers turned on her, his anger finding a new target. "Don't you start, Susanna. You've been sitting there all high and mighty, making faces, trying to undermine me throughout this entire interview. If you have such a problem with how I conduct my program, perhaps you should reconsider whether you want to be here at all." The threat was clear, but Susanna didn't back down. Her voice remained steady, professional, but there was steel underneath. "This isn't your program, Piers. It's our program. And what just happened was unacceptable. We lost a guest, a legendary actor, because you couldn't set aside your personal feelings about people who have nothing to do with him or his career. The production team is getting calls already from viewers complaining about how he was treated. This is going to be a PR disaster, and it was entirely avoidable." Before Piers could respond, the director's voice came through their earpieces, audible enough that viewers at home could hear the tension. "We need to go to commercial. Now." Piers's face was still flushed with anger as he addressed the camera directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be taking a break. When we come back, we'll discuss what happens when celebrities put political correctness ahead of honest conversation." As the cameras cut away and the show went to commercial break, the studio remained tense and uncomfortable. Crew members were whispering to each other, many shaking their heads in disbelief. Piers stormed off the set without speaking to anyone, leaving Susanna alone at the desk, her head in her hands. In the green room, where guests normally waited after their appearances, Michael Caine sat quietly, still processing what had just happened. A young production assistant approached hesitantly, clearly unsure what to say. "Sir Michael, I just wanted to tell you that what you said in there about mental health and compassion, that really mattered. My sister struggled with depression for years, and hearing someone like you defend the importance of believing people when they talk about their pain, that means more than you know." "Thank you." Michael looked up at the young woman and managed a small smile. "That's very kind of you to say. I'm sorry you and your sister had to go through that. I hope she's doing better now." "She is, thanks to good support, and people who believed her when she said she was struggling. Unlike some people who have platforms they clearly don't deserve." The bitterness in her voice was clear, and Michael sighed heavily. "He's not a bad person fundamentally, you know. Piers. He's just let his ego and his anger consume everything else that might have been good about him. It's tragic in its own way, though I'm sure he'd never see it like that." Within hours, the footage of Michael Caine walking off Good Morning Britain after his confrontation with Piers Morgan had exploded across social media. Clips were being shared millions of times, with the overwhelming majority of comments supporting Michael's stance and condemning Piers's behavior. Mental health organizations praised Michael for his defense of compassion and belief in people's experiences. Several celebrities came forward to share their own stories of struggling with mental health while dealing with public scrutiny. The backlash against Piers was swift and severe. Sponsors began pulling advertisements from the program. Ofcom, the British broadcasting regulator, received thousands of complaints about the interview. Media commentators across the political spectrum criticized the aggressive treatment of a respected guest and the insertion of personal vendettas into what should have been a straightforward interview. By that evening, ITV released a statement expressing regret over how the interview had been conducted and reaffirming their commitment to treating all guests with respect and dignity. Piers himself took to social media to defend his actions, claiming he'd been ambushed by someone he thought was a friend and insisting he stood by every word he'd said. But even his usual supporters seemed divided, with many suggesting he'd crossed a line by turning a friendly interview into a personal confrontation. Several days later, in a quieter moment away from the cameras and the chaos, Michael Caine was asked in a different interview about what had happened that morning on Good Morning Britain. His response was measured, thoughtful, and tinged with sadness. "Look," he said, "I don't take any pleasure in what happened. Piers and I had been friendly for years, and I'd always respected his willingness to ask tough questions and challenge conventional thinking. But somewhere along the line, and I think we all saw it happening, he stopped being a journalist who challenged people and became someone with a personal axe to grind. And when that happens, when you let personal feelings drive your professional work to that extent, you lose perspective. You lose the ability to see people as human beings rather than targets." What bothered me most wasn't that he wanted to discuss controversial topics. I've never shied away from difficult conversations. What bothered me was his complete inability to show even a shred of compassion or empathy when discussing someone's mental health struggles. The interviewer pressed gently, asking if Michael thought the friendship could be repaired. Michael was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I don't know. Friendships require mutual respect, and I'm not sure that's possible anymore between us. He feels I betrayed him by not supporting his crusade, and I feel he's betrayed basic principles of human decency. Those are difficult gaps to bridge. But I hope, genuinely hope, that someday he'll step back and realize that being right, or thinking you're right, isn't worth losing your humanity over. That speaking your mind doesn't have to mean speaking without kindness. That you can be honest and compassionate at the same time. Maybe that's naive of me at 91 years old, but I'd rather be naive and kind than cynical and cruel." As for Piers Morgan, he continued hosting Good Morning Britain for several more weeks. But the incident had marked a turning point. The criticism didn't fade, ratings began to suffer, and eventually, in a move that surprised few who had watched his increasing volatility, he parted ways with the program amid yet another controversy. In interviews afterward, he would occasionally reference the Michael Caine incident, always framing it as him being punished for speaking truth, never acknowledging that perhaps the issue wasn't what he said, but how he said it, and why. The story of that January morning became a case study in how personal feelings can poison professional relationships, how platforms can be misused for vendettas, and how sometimes standing up for basic human decency means walking away from situations that compromise your values. Michael Caine's dignified exit, his clear articulation of why compassion matters more than scoring points, and his refusal to participate in what he saw as cruel entertainment, resonated with millions of people who were tired of meanness masquerading as honesty. In the end, the confrontation revealed something important: that true strength isn't found in relentlessly attacking those who can't fight back on equal terms. It's found in standing up for what's right, even when it costs you personally. Michael Caine walked away from that studio having lost a friendship, but having gained the respect of countless people who watched him choose kindness over cruelty, principle over popularity, and dignity over drama. And sometimes that trade is worth making.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.